Welcome, everyone. I'm here with Steve Boggs, my dear friend, for Living Library interview. And it's an honor and joy to see you, Steve. And I'd like to just welcome you and invite you to share anything about your own evolution as a Trillium teacher, what your initial sense of being a teacher would be like, your orientation, and what might have changed in your focus or practice over time, and all of this with an eye towards speaking to new teachers. What advice might you offer? Just wherever you want to go with any of that.
Okay. Well, I would say that I came to this work rather late in my life. I was probably in my 60s, and I came from nearly 40 years of practicing and teaching meditation. And it was pretty serious practice because the last 35 years I was devoting probably an average of 3 hours a day practice. And there were a number of periods during those 30 years when I took longer, more extended courses of 3 months or 6 months or 9 months where we would meditate 7 or 8 hours a day. And you can imagine in situations like that, you come into some pretty rarefied states. And I think it's safe to say for those 30 years, I was very much a transcendentalist. I was going to say in search of, but I wouldn't say in search of so much. I was cultivating the one, the true, the pure, the immovable, the uncreated, the unfailingly radiant, heatless, smokeless, effulgent of the self. And that glorious goal was rewarded. It was. I was not without substantial experience of that. You don't continue doing something for 40 years if you're not making some pretty good progress. And I would say that in my experience of that period, there was a long trail of what at the time were described as good experiences, both in meditation and outside. And but the thing is, when you continue that for such a long time and don't entirely, how do I say this? Don't entirely arrive at your stated goal that all those adjectives I just threw out there. The tendency, and so often even the instruction is, well, meditate more or do these other things. You don't do that for that long without accumulating lots of advanced techniques and procedures and processes and whistles and bells. And I didn't even realize it, but I was like one of those female acrobats in a Chinese acrobatic thing, that they have those sticks and they spin these plates.
Oh, yeah.
Then they have one and they get two. Oh, man, they can do two. And then I do, and that 3. And then and they get more and more, and they're spinning these like 5 plates, and they're riding a unicycle, and the unicycle's on a balance bar. And if you practice that, you get to be quite adept at a lot of whistles and bells, and I was like that after 40 years. So
I assume it did not feel precarious at all. You were comfortable.
To the person who's doing that, who's practiced that for 40 years, 5 plates is nothing. 10 plates might be a challenge, And no, it felt normal. It was a natural progression of more advanced techniques and more, okay, so now do this. And increasing familiarity with that really deep zone somewhere between thought and perception and these subtle feels. And they also spilled over into your life, into, okay, what to eat, how to eat, when to eat, what herbs to take at what time of the year, and more was always available. As you know, there's no end to self-improvement, and it got into, well, what color clothes should you wear, what gemstones should you wear, what periods of your life, on which finger of your hand do you install it on, what day of the week, what kind of house should you live in, what proportions in, and what compass direction should you face when you're standing at the sink or sitting on the toilet? And there's no end, And I was doing all that. It seemed natural. The goal was so precious and so, inculcated into me. All these little things accumulate, and your whole life is directed towards that. And I ultimately I started to feel like I was kind of on a Zeno's paradox of approach, without that self-validating confirmation of arrival. I was getting closer and closer and closer and wondering if I'd ever arrive. You know that? Zeno's paradox, yeah. And coincidentally, at that same time, some friends of mine who had accompanied me on this long journey, 40 years, said, we found this finishing school, which we think is pretty great, and you should look into it, Steve, because this might be right up your alley. Mm. And it was this work, and my first experience of this, I was here in Fairfield, and Saniel turned up in town and made a presentation at the Fairfield Public Library in 2002. And I was a little nervous there because I was then going to become a apostate in the ashram, because the whole town of Fairfield is an ashram, basically. 2,500 diehard spiritual seekers, all doing the same, all those techniques that I was referring to. And here I was showing up. I was casting a wider net, which is not common here. And so I was set somewhere in the middle, maybe towards the back. And and the first thing Saniel said was, "Well, I'd like everyone to say who they are and what they expect from being here. I mean, I like to get a feel for who you people are." And I thought, "Oh, great." just
I'm trying to be invisible.
Yeah, I've always been a very innocent, sincere, overly earnest, diligent seeker, and here I was, becoming heterodox. So I figured out something I thought was sufficiently respectable to say in 30 seconds, and finally got to be my turn. I was looking at Saniel, and he was looking at me, and everything I thought I was going to say was just gone. I didn't know I was just panicked. And all I could do, when I heard myself blurting out was, "I'm just so tired of swinging back and forth between hope and resignation." And then I just put my hands in my face and cried quietly to myself. And I thought, holy crap, what the hell's going on here? And it was my first taste of the power of this transmission.
Oh, how beautiful.
To pierce and cut through all of the mental accretion, all the respectable stuff that you have to present yourself to the world, and to call out who you actually are in your heart of hearts, and to enliven that and to bring it to the fore. And little did I know it at the time, but I was a large and dry pile of kindling waiting for the spark of this transmission. And I have been helplessly aflame ever since December of 2002.
What a great metaphor.
Yeah, so this work is based on most of the heavy lifting, and this is based on a transmission. It's completely different than the Advaitic dimension of what I was doing before, because it's very much like most conventional spirituality, which is typically thought of as an ascent. You're in search of greater purity, greater accumulation of greater spiritual clarity, and you're climbing Jacob's ladder. Whether it's Western, Eastern, probably 80% of these processes have to do with ascent and increasing purification and cultivating the numinous. And this, I discovered initially, to my dismay, that it's a descent. It's unnerving, and it's feels hazardous, and actually is, and it's threatening to all of the accumulations of spiritual and psychological armor that we've accumulated in living this life and in a world where love really hasn't taken its hold yet, and we all come to this with our tender spots, and it's a tantric process, but I want to immediately clarify. I want to use that word. It's, in the West, Tantra has unfortunately become known as making a religion out of having great sex. And it's not that. That's such a superficial and insubstantial simplification. There's a long and rich, deep lineage that goes with this, and which stems from something called Kashmir Shaivism, and it's the difference between most of spiritual processes and this is that there's not a lot of practices for you to impose on yourself. There's not so many do's and don'ts, and all the things that are thought of often as obstacles to spiritual growth in this work are embraced, and through that embrace, transformed. And ultimately, and here's the key, ultimately realized to not only not be obstacles, but to not actually be separate from that what you thought was that wondrous spiritual goal that you were going to inhabit one day when you rose above all of the limitations. Mm. The question that this process asks is, what if there's nothing to renounce? It's a breathtaking question, because this awakening happens right in the trenches of life. And I would say that some years ago there was a play off Broadway in New York called "Now Hear This." It sounds like a prelude to an announcement on a naval submarine or something. Now hear this. This is the captain speaking. Adjust to degree 281 or whatever. But that's not it. The second word, the second word of this is H-E-R-E. Mm. Now hear this. And that kind of symbolizes how I sense how this work takes place, how it is embodied in this world right now, right here, just this. Whatever is arising within you internally or externally in your circumstances is where this awakening occurs. Mm. And in that way, all the things that you've been avoiding, some of your worst stuff you thought of as your greatest impediments, can be part of your spiritual journey through that embrace. And that is so kind of diametrically opposite to that purity that I was cultivating for so long. So I guess what I would say about myself as a teacher is what I transmit and teach is the divinity of ordinary life. Mm. And what I've come to know is that there's a porous, tender, burning communion with all things that characterizes, in some people, this embodied, awakened life. And that's very much the quality of what I found in my awakened life. And there's a kind of radical intimacy that presents itself, and the paradox of being both distinct and not separate there's a felt sense of kinship with everything that happens all around you, and the tradition I used to be part of, there's an idea in Sanskrit concept Maya, Maya is often thought of as that. Maya, translated directly, is that which is not. And it's often interpreted as the world is an illusion. And the ego is not existent. And you just have to see it truly. And I think a better definition of Maya is all things are separate. Because for me, the most fundamental quality that I recognize in this awakening is this non-separateness with everything. What I call this radical intimacy. And you're not separate from what? From the cynicism and guile of our president, or from the appalling or the intense reaction of people to him, or the love and devotion of those who follow him. And you're not separate from the hunger and the thirst and the sleep deprivation and the fear of the migrants walking thousands of miles across the desert in southern Mexico and fleeing in hopes that their children might not die before their time. And you're not separate from any of that. And and you're not separate from the little girl who's in her first school uniform in early September, holding her mother's hand, crossing the street in front of your truck. And she's looking up at her mother with trepidation and with exhilaration. And her mother is looking down at her with such endearment. And the little girl says, "Mommy, why are you crying?" And she says, "It's okay, honey. I'm crying because I'm so happy." And you're not separate from that. Mm-hmm. When you see that, you're just pierced by it. And that's this awakened life for me. And I think it's probably fair to say that most of the members of the Trillium Awakening Teacher Circle have some version of this embodied awakening, but I don't think it's any secret that the more florid dimensions of my awakened life make me somewhat of an outlier in that group, and I've become comfortable with that over the years. And if I were to say anything to new teachers, I would say a large part, it seems to me, of your awakened life is going to have to do with the divine archetypes that may actually be here for you to personify in this world. Because that's probably the most meaningful question that arises in this awakened life is, okay, well, now I'm finally really here, so what next? What do I do now? And so I would say lean into those subtle parts of yourself which sometimes make you feel awkward. Magnify your eccentricities. And it might make the blood run cold, but I've often found that the places that are feel like the shyest and tenderest parts of who you are, those are where your gifts lie. And you will never feel more exposed than when you reveal that part of yourself. And you will also be you'll never be more radiantly generous to the world. And at that moment, when you are naked to the world, to this tender, subtle, but actually quite resilient part of yourself. It doesn't feel that way when you're first taking it out for a spin to see what it's going to reveal. But it is resilient, and I would encourage you to find those shy, tender parts of yourself and see if you can give them voice.
So inspiring and encouraging and beautiful. It just feels like manna from heaven hearing this. And can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Like, coming from the tradition you did, where the role of teacher was very different than the role in this work.
Yes.
Was that like you just intuitively reconfigured into the stream of this? Was there a disjunct at the beginning, or how did you
not really, because like I said, I was kindling, and once I was a flame, that was the new direction, and it's clear to me that's who I'm here to be. And in the 16 years since then, it hasn't diminished. It hasn't. I could say it's a lot more manageable. The intensity is less breathtaking than it was at the beginning, and somehow I guess my nervous system has adapted to running at a higher voltage.
Spoken as an electrician, yes.
Yes. And actually, I was listening to a scientist talk about this, and he said, actually, there's a lot of neuroplasticity, even late in life, 60s and 70s. They've observed that actually in long time, 10,000 hour, 20, 30,000 hour meditators, the amygdala actually gets smaller. And there are parts of the neocortex, the gray matter gets thicker, and your brain does change later in your life. And so, yeah, no, it wasn't difficult because I was, when I fell into this and caught fire, it had a life of its own, and I was trying to just catch up with what was already galloping and shimmering across the universe. Steve Boggs' character was finally in full throat.
I just love your use of language. I imagine that's very catalytic for students, because it's so vivid and embodied, this galloping and shimmering. I can just see it and feel it, and I sense that that's a tremendous gift that you just spontaneously are able to offer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope so. And I would say shimmering. I would just say that it's more. It has become the new normal for me. But still, I would still say that there is just that nameless something that's unfathomable, and it shimmers just beneath the surface of everything. And it's always there, and it touches me in all these different forms, like I mentioned, the mother escorting her daughter across the street, or in the challenging forms of it, because your non-separateness is not just with the good stuff. You're not separate from the whole range of from the most ecstatic to the most case of greatest depraved indifference. There's a part of you which feels intimate with that, and it's a challenge to be in the tumble of that living in this realm where everything is so temporal and so contingent and so shifting, and yet here you are, and you are not separate from any of it as it tumbles through its kaleidoscope, and that's you. And that's how the deeply embodied awakening life is often felt, seems to me.
That is so rich and generous and gorgeous, Steve. So appreciate you.
Thank
Does
you.
anything else arise to be shared?
Well, what's still an exploration for me. It's becoming more clear. I'm trying to find the words for it, but I would say, that self I referred to, the one, the true, the pure, the immovable, the unfailing radiant that I was seeking in sitting on a cushion by myself. I find now that the true self, capital T, capital S, is I guess the best way I could say it is it's the indivisible field of love that actually surrounds us and is omnipresent, and it's the air that we breathe. It's like a fundamental force, like gravity. In a sense, I would say it's like gravity, and like gravity is an attractive force that's always drawing everything, all matter, into closer connection. Gravity is the eros of matter, and like that, this fundamental field. There's got to be a better word, but I can't know what it is. But this fundamental field of love, which it's just there, and most accurately characterizes the true self that I was seeking all those 40 years.
Yeah. Wow. Yes, I resonate with all that you have said, and I couldn't possibly have articulated it. So your naming of all this is like a validation and a green lighting and acknowledging this dimension. You're like a poet laureate of this archetype. Do you have a name for your archetype?
I would say it's the devotee. If it was the devotee, the one who's just, for whom adoration comes naturally.
Mm-hmm.
You know that.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to that and to many more conversations with you.
Yeah, I hope so.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you, Deborah. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.